this wall is an azuri blue for a good reason. It's because in ancient Babylon, their deep blue walls, that's the context for the first appearance of the writings on the wall. And it comes from the biblical phrase from the book of Daniel in chapter 5. And if we take the text at face value, then Daniel has been deported along with thousands of other Jews to the ancient city of Babylon after a defeat in 586 BC. And it's at an indulgent feast hosted by the king Belshazzar that a phantom hand suddenly appears and writes the now famous words Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This classical biblical moment was depicted by Rembrandt in his famous painting Belshazzar's Feast. If we translate these Aramaic Hebrew words, then we get numbered, weighed, divided. Or more fully, your empire has been looked at, judged, and will be divided in two. And indeed, the next day, King Belshazzar is dead, and the Persians overrun the Babylonian army, and the Israelites are able finally to go home to Israel. So this classic biblical moment was depicted by Rembrandt in his famous painting Belshazzar's Feast. It will offer us a framework for thinking through the imminent dangers that we face under climate change. More specifically, these are the four aspects. Firstly, this is a big party, so there's a lot of party vibes happening, yet at the same time, this is an empire which is under serious attack. Secondly, the vividness of the truth. If you look at those letters that are shining, it's there are two sources of light in this painting, and one of them are those letters which illuminate the scene, and the third is the sudden drama of it all. There's hand movements. This is in a way a moment of great action. And finally, there's looting. If you look to the left on the painting, or the guy's right hand, you can see there that some of those objects have been looted from Jerusalem. These are the goblets and cups that have been made from the melted down gold from the captive Israelites' temple. So first, let's look at the party vibes. This is not a 21st century party, of course. Rembrandt is painting this in the clothes and the design of his time, but it's obviously very rich. Now, in climate change, as we saw in previous chapters, climate change is being caused by the countries, in a sense, who are having the biggest party, or have had the biggest party. These are the ultra-high developed nations. So if we take four examples, first of all, we have Australia. So Australia, on a 5-year trend, is still increasing its emissions by 1.7%. Now, the good news is that it's promised to reduce its emissions by 2.4%. But if we are to avoid the invasion of Mother Nature into civilization, in order to limit warming up to 1.5 degrees, Australia would have to reduce its emissions by an astonishing 52% per year from today. So that's like Australia being carbon neutral in 2 years. For Australia to do its fair share for 2 degrees, it would have to reduce its emissions by 16% per year. Second country, let's take Austria. And Austria, on a 5-year trend, has been increasing its emissions still by 0.3% per year. But the good news again is that it's promised to reduce them by 4.1% per year. Yet that 4.1% is well below what is needed for 1.5 degrees, so they would need to cut emissions by 37% per year, and for 2 degrees they would have to cut them by 11%. And finally, Norway, again, as we saw in previous chapters, just because you've got nice fjords or nice mountains, or because you look green and have electric cars or whatever, Well, that doesn't mean that you're actually doing your responsible bit for climate change. So let's take Norway. Norway has a 5-year trend, and that trend is still increasing. Norway's still increasing its emissions at 0.6 degrees per year. Now, the very good news with Norway is it's actually promised to reduce its emissions by 8.8% per year. That's still nowhere near enough for 1.5 degrees, which would require a 27% reduction per year starting from now. And for 2 degrees, it would need to cut it by 9.5% per year. Which takes us to the second aspect of this painting, the vividness of the truth. There's an incredible dissonance between what has been happening, the emissions we continue to pump into the atmosphere, and the catastrophic consequences which will result from that. And the dissonance comes from the fact that we still haven't accepted somewhere, psychologically, socially, politically, economically, or whatever, that we have to actually square up to the carbon budget described in previous chapters. And the funny thing is that this invasion, just like the Babylonians are about to be invaded by the Persians, this invasion is right on our doorstep, and yet the party always carries on. We find another way of not looking at it, but that's not because the data isn't clear enough. Indeed, the people in this painting are forced to look at the truth. And in some ways we have been forced. There have been hurricanes of increasing power and intensity and frequency. There's been flooding. There's been forest fires. We know very well what these signals are. If you look at the key data and you look at the key conclusions of the science, this is not reflected in education about climate change. We remain extremely soft, extremely careful, and very timid about the situation. It's time for climate change bingo! This game is just the best. Anyone can play for all your climate change educational needs. This bingo has it all. So how do we know if a school is grappling with the climate crisis at the level required? Well, we can play this bingo game. So you can take a speech from anybody in the school, from a school director, or from a teacher, or from lessons or anything, or maybe a section on a website, and you can do a little word spot. What kind of words are the most common words in the document or in the speech? And as you look on the screen here, you can see words like litter or waste or recycling. Those in general are triggers for a good start, but nowhere near enough. It's a difficult thing to talk about this because you don't want to disempower or flatten the enthusiasm of people who are obviously engaged in doing very valuable work on green issues. But this climate crisis has only ever seen greenhouse gas emissions increase and accelerate. And the reason for us never getting on top of things is we've never asked the deeper questions. We've never asked the systems questions. We've never been willing to put on the table much bigger, deeper questions about what we're doing. All the things which schools tend to do about climate tend to be focused on the individual, they tend to be tactile, and if you really think about it, most students can understand those things in primary school. What is really needed is an emergency, is like an urgent change in the way in which we talk about climate change, the way in which we think about it, and the way in which we grapple with it. And for that, you need a whole new set of vocabulary. Scientists tell us that this is a crisis, an existential crisis. So therefore, we should be talking about that. We should be talking about tipping points. We should be talking about systems change. We should be talking about catastrophes. And we should be keeping, as it says in previous chapters, a very strict and close eye on the carbon budget. So you can see in these sets of words the kinds of vocabulary and the level of thinking which is required for us to actually truly have a signal that this school or these students are grappling with climate change at the right level. There is a sudden drama in this painting which Rembrandt captures, and that drama is not evident in how we teach climate education in schools. And so, to the fourth aspect of this painting, and that is to do with the looted objects which you can see on the table. The Babylonians, when they occupied Israel and took it over, they took all the gold out of the temple, so the lost ark is probably going to be lost for much longer, unless Indiana Jones is going to have a sudden breakthrough. But the likelihood is that you're looking at something where that the ark of the temple was probably made into little plates and dishes that you can see here in the painting by the Babylonians. So we have a small nation, Israel, invaded by a very large empire, the Babylonians. And this is in fact very similar, as you've seen in previous chapters, to the situation we have in climate change, in that the very high developed nations are polluting the atmosphere with their emissions, and the smaller nations just have to, in a sense, suck it up. Let's have a look at a couple of examples. Kenya, a country which in the 19th century was colonized by the English, now is having its atmosphere colonized by European and ultra-high developed countries' emissions. Because when you look at the data here, for Kenya to do its fair share, to keep the atmosphere, the warming at 1.5 degrees, would only have to reduce its emissions by 1.5%. And for 2 degrees, it would have to reduce them by 1.1%. And in the case of Tanzania, a neighbouring country, for it to do its fair share for 1.5 degrees, then it would have to reduce its emissions by just 1.1%. And in fact, it could actually increase its emissions by 1.4%, and that would still be consistent with a 2-degree temperature rise. Let's hear what Ramina Paulette, a Kenyan Fridays for Future activist, thinks about that.
Hi, my name is Ramina Paulette, a climate activist from Kenya. I'm currently here in Belgium together with the awesome Matthew Pai for the Climate Academy. Yesterday we had a lovely session together with the feminist clubs and also the students in European school here in Belgium, talking about the climate crisis. Well, I could say the climate crisis has affected us, especially from my area, which is Kenya, with different types of effects, most especially the floods in the western side and the northern side, the droughts that has led our country to become much more devastated economically and even in terms of environment. So right now we are currently speaking with Mr. Matthew on how the different nations contribute towards climate change and how they could less the emissions, most especially the countries in the European nations that are the ones to be blamed on the climate crisis. And I think it's really important for us to consider having more dialogues on solving the climate crisis in different places, including intersectionality and intergenerational dialogues to be part of the conversation.